They gave me 30 days to tear down a barn that had stood on my family's farm for over 60 years. No warning, no negotiation. Just a letter, a fine, and a deadline. I spent weeks fighting it, staring at old surveys, old deeds, old paperwork my grandfather left behind, trying to understand how a building older than most of that HOA board members' own homes had suddenly become a violation. Then I found the one document they never expected me to see. The HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. My grandfather bought this land in 1958, back when this entire valley was nothing but farmland and a 2-lane road connecting it to the nearest town. He built the barn with his own hands the following spring, using lumber he'd milled himself from trees cleared off the property. My father was born in the farmhouse behind it. I was born there too, 31 years later. And I've spent every year since learning how to keep this place running the way they did. Cattle in the back pasture, a small orchard my grandmother planted, and that same barn standing exactly where it's always stood, weathered but solid, holding tools and equipment that have outlasted 3 generations of Sutherlands. For most of my life, this land sat quiet and mostly alone, bordered by fields and a scattering of other family farms that had been here just as long as we had. That started changing about 8 years ago, when a development company bought up nearly 400 acres directly adjacent to our property line and began building what would eventually become Millbrook Farms Estates, a sprawling community of nearly 600 homes, complete with a golf course, a resort-style pool, and a clubhouse large enough to host weddings. I want to be clear that I never had a problem with the development itself. Land changes hands. Communities grow. My father always said the only thing you can count on in farming is that the world around you won't stay the same, and I believed him. I sold nothing. I fought nothing. I simply kept doing what my family had always done on the acreage we still owned outright, watching new rooftops rise up along what used to be open field. The trouble was, Millbrook Farms Estates came with a homeowners association, and that homeowners association came with a woman named Patricia Vance. Patricia has served as HOA board president for the last 5 years, ever since the community reached enough occupied homes to hold its first formal election. She's the kind of person who treats the neighborhood's governing documents the way some people treat scripture, memorized, quoted freely, and applied with an intensity that seems to exceed what any reasonable homeowner actually expects from a board tasked with mowing schedules and paint colors. Under her leadership, the HOA had developed something of a reputation for aggressive enforcement, even among homes that were fully inside the community boundary. Fines over trampoline placement. A formal notice about a mailbox flag left in the up position for too long. The kind of pettiness that, frankly, had nothing to do with me, since my property has never technically belonged to Millbrook Farms Estates at all. That distinction mattered to me more than I ever expected it would. My land isn't part of the HOA. It never has been. My grandfather's original deed predates the entire development by over 5 decades, surveyed and recorded under county jurisdiction long before Millbrook Farms existed even as an idea. I'd assumed, reasonably I thought, that this made my family's farm essentially invisible to whatever rules and fines Patricia enforced inside her own community. For years, that assumption held up exactly the way I expected it to. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, standing in my barn on an ordinary Tuesday morning checking on a tractor engine, was that Patricia Vance had spent the better part of the last year growing increasingly fixated on my property line. Not because of anything I'd done, but because of where exactly. My barn happened to sit in relation to a boundary marker that had shifted, quietly and almost imperceptibly. In the community's official plat maps sometime during the development's second phase of construction, I had no idea that a discrepancy buried in a survey filed years ago was about to become the center of a dispute that would consume the next several months of my life. I had no idea that the very same clubhouse Patricia used to hold her board meetings, the one she'd spent years defending as the crown jewel of Millbrook Farms Estates, was tied to that exact same discrepancy in ways neither of us fully understood yet. I just remember the certified letter that arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in my mailbox like it belonged there, informing me that my barn, a structure that had stood on this land for over 60 years, longer than Patricia Vance had been alive, was now considered a violation of Millbrook Farms Estate's architectural guidelines, and that I had 30 days to remove it. I read that letter 3 times standing in my own kitchen, absolutely certain there had to be some kind of mistake. My barn wasn't inside Millbrook Farms Estates. It had never been inside Millbrook Farms Estates. I called the HOA management office the same afternoon, expecting a quick correction, an apology for an obvious clerical error. What I got instead was a woman on the phone reading directly from what she called an updated community plat map, insisting that recent survey work conducted during the development's second phase had confirmed my barn sat 11 feet across what she described as the community's official boundary line. When I told her my grandfather's deed, recorded decades before Millbrook Farms Estates existed, placed that same barn well within my own property, she simply repeated that the HOA was relying on its own updated survey data, and that until I provided documentation proving otherwise, the violation notice would stand. I asked her to send me a copy of this updated survey. It took 9 days and 4 phone calls before anyone actually did. When it finally arrived, I spread it across my kitchen table alongside my grandfather's original 1958 deed and a county survey my father had commissioned in the 90s during a fence dispute with a since-departed neighbor. The discrepancy was immediately obvious, even to someone without a surveying background. The new plat map, filed just 2 years earlier during Millbrook Farms' second construction phase, shifted the shared boundary line nearly 40 feet in the development's favor along the entire stretch bordering my property, not just near my barn. 40 feet that, according to every document my family had ever held, legally belonged to us. I called a county land surveyor the same week, a calm, thorough woman named Elaine Rourke who'd worked disputes like this for over 20 years. She reviewed both documents in her office, cross-referencing them against county GIS records while I sat across from her, trying not to let my frustration show. She told me, in the measured tone professionals use when they already suspect the answer but want to be certain before saying it out loud, that discrepancies of this size were unusual, and that she'd need to conduct a physical resurvey using the original recorded monuments before she could say anything definitively. That resurvey took another 2 weeks to schedule, 2 weeks during which the HOA's fines began. The first fine arrived by mail 11 days after the initial notice, citing continued non-compliance with the architectural violation, $75 a day, retroactive to the original 30-day deadline that I hadn't even reached yet. I called the management office again, pointing out that the deadline itself hadn't passed, that I was actively disputing the underlying boundary claim, that fining someone for a violation still under formal review seemed, at minimum, procedurally backwards. The woman on the phone told me fines accrue automatically once a violation notice is issued, regardless of any pending dispute, and that if I wanted the fines paused, I'd need to submit a formal appeal request directly to the board in writing for review at their discretion. I submitted that appeal the same day. It sat, unacknowledged, for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I noticed something that unsettled me more than the fines themselves. Patricia Vance began walking the boundary line herself, almost daily, sometimes with her small dog, sometimes alone, always pausing at the same spot near my barn, occasionally taking photographs on her phone. I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older man named Curtis who'd farmed the adjacent parcel for almost as long as my family had farmed ours, and he told me he'd noticed the same thing, except Patricia had been doing this for well over a year, long before my violation notice ever arrived. That detail sat with me longer than I expected it to. Elaine's resurvey finally happened on a cold, overcast morning in early spring. I stood at the edge of my property watching her crew locate the original recorded monuments, decades-old iron pins buried beneath years of soil and grass growth, cross-referencing their positions against both the county's historical records and the HOA's new plat map. It took the better part of a full day, and Elaine promised me a written report within the week. What that report confirmed, when it finally arrived, was worse than I expected, and in a direction I hadn't anticipated at all. The original monuments, the ones legally establishing my family's property line since 1958, hadn't moved. They were exactly where county records said they'd always been. The HOA's updated plat map, the one used to justify my violation notice, had been drafted using a private survey commissioned by the development company during construction, one that Elaine's report described in careful professional language as containing significant deviation from established monument positioning consistent with the original recorded boundary. In plain terms, the developer's own survey had been wrong, not slightly wrong, 40 feet wrong along the entire shared boundary, which meant every structure Millbrook Farms Estates had built along that boundary line during their second construction phase now sat, at least partially, on land that legally belonged to me. I sat with Elaine's report for an entire evening before I let myself fully consider what that meant, tracing the shifted boundary line across a printed site map she'd included, following it past my barn, past my back pasture fence, all the way toward the section of the development built during that same construction phase, the section that included Millbrook Farms Estates Clubhouse. I called my attorney the next morning, a sharp, unflappable woman named Denise Alvarez who'd handled a boundary dispute for my father years earlier and still remembered our family's original deed by name. I sent her everything: Elaine's report, the original 1958 deed, the HOA's mistaken plat map, the fine notices, my unanswered appeal. Denise called me back within 2 hours, and the first thing she said wasn't reassuring in the way I wanted, but it was clarifying in a way I desperately needed. She told me that if Elaine's resurvey held up, and if the clubhouse genuinely sat, even partially, on land outside Millbrook Farms Estate's legal boundary, this was no longer simply a fine dispute over an old barn. This was a potential encroachment claim against a multi-million-dollar community asset, one the HOA had spent years insisting was untouchable, one Patricia Vance had personally defended in board meetings, newsletters, and at least 2 contentious town halls I'd heard about secondhand from Curtis. She asked me one question before we hung up, a question I hadn't let myself fully consider until she said it out loud. Did I want to quietly resolve the barn violation and let the boundary discrepancy stay buried in a surveyor's report nobody outside this kitchen table had seen yet? Or did I want to find out exactly how much of that clubhouse was sitting on land that had belonged to my family since before Patricia Vance was born? I didn't answer her right away. I sat there instead, staring at that shifted boundary line stretching across the printed map in front of me, thinking about 60 years of fines that had never once been levied against my family. A barn my grandfather built with his own hands now facing demolition over 11 feet that had never actually crossed any real line at all. And a woman who'd spent the last year walking that same boundary, taking photographs, watching, waiting for exactly the kind of excuse she'd finally found. I thought about Patricia standing at her podium during those town halls Curtis had mentioned, defending that clubhouse as the pride of an entire community, and I realized I already knew exactly what I wanted to do next. Denise didn't wait for my answer the way I expected her to. Within a week, she'd already set the next stage of this in motion, quietly and methodically, the same way Elaine had approached the resurvey. She commissioned a full boundary encroachment study, expanding beyond my barn to cover the entire disputed section of the shared property line, specifically requesting Elaine's firm to precisely map exactly which Millbrook Farms Estates structures crossed onto our land, and by how much. Elaine's crew spent 4 days on site, working section by section, cross-referencing every original monument against the development's actual built footprint. What came back made the barn dispute look almost laughably small by comparison. The clubhouse, the crown jewel Patricia had spent years defending, sat with its entire east wing, nearly 1,800 square feet, built directly on land that belonged to my family under our original 1958 deed, not close to the boundary, not arguably close, fully, unmistakably across it, according to monuments that had never moved, verified now by 2 separate licensed surveys pointing to the exact same conclusion. Denise sent a formal notice of encroachment to Millbrook Farms Estates HOA board the same afternoon the report came back, copying their legal counsel, copying the county recorder's office, and copying Patricia Vance directly by name. The letter laid out the facts in plain, unemotional language. A structure built partially on land outside the association's legal boundary. A community asset used for board meetings, weddings, and daily amenity access, sitting, in part, on private property belonging to someone else entirely. And a formal demand for immediate acknowledgement of the encroachment, along with the retroactive dismissal of every fine issued against my barn, since the very survey used to justify those fines had just been proven wrong by 2 independent licensed reports. I didn't hear anything for 6 days. On the 7th, I got a call informing me an emergency board meeting had been scheduled and that my presence, along with my attorneys, was specifically requested. I brought Denise. I brought both surveys. I brought my grandfather's original deed, the paper worn soft at the folds from decades of handling, the same document that had somehow, after 60 years, become the single most important piece of paper in this entire dispute. The community clubhouse was packed that night, more homeowners than I'd expected, word having apparently spread through Millbrook Farms Estates the way word does in any tight-knit community once something interesting starts happening. Patricia sat at the head of the board table, composed in the same clipped, controlled way I'd heard described in every phone call I'd made to that office, though I noticed her hands stayed folded a little too tightly in front of her, her eyes flicking toward the door every few minutes like she was waiting for something to interrupt this before it could fully begin. Denise spoke first, calm and measured, laying out the timeline exactly as it happened. My grandfather's original deed, the HOA's mistaken plat map, the barn violation notice built entirely on that flawed survey, the independent resurvey confirming the original monuments had never moved, and finally the discovery that the same construction phase responsible for the barn dispute had also placed the clubhouse itself partially on land it never legally owned. I watched the room shift the moment Denise said the word clubhouse. A murmur spread across those folding chairs, homeowners turning to look at each other, then back at Patricia, then at the surveys Denise held up for the room to see. One man near the back, someone I didn't recognize, asked flatly whether this meant the community's most expensive shared amenity was sitting on stolen land. Denise clarified carefully that stolen wasn't the right word, that this appeared to be an honest surveying error made during construction, but that regardless of intent, the legal reality remained the same. 1,800 square feet of that clubhouse belonged to my family, and had for over 60 years. Patricia finally spoke, her voice tighter than the composed tone I'd heard on those recorded board calls, insisting the HOA's survey had been professionally conducted, that she personally couldn't be held responsible for a construction phase error that predated her own board tenure by exactly 1 year. It was a technically true statement that did nothing to explain why she'd spent the last year personally walking that same boundary line, photographing my barn, building a violation case against a family whose land had apparently been quietly propping up her own community's crown jewel the entire time. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken man named Walter who'd stayed silent for most of the meeting, asked Patricia directly whether she'd been aware of any boundary concerns before authorizing my violation notice. The silence that followed told the room everything it needed to know. Walter pressed further, asking why, if she'd genuinely believed the survey was accurate, she hadn't disclosed her own repeated visits to the boundary line over the past year, visits multiple homeowners in that very room, including Curtis, could apparently confirm under oath if this ever escalated to something more formal than a board meeting. Patricia didn't answer that question at all. Denise used that silence to lay out our actual demand, calm and unshaken, exactly the way she'd laid out every fact before it. Full retroactive dismissal of every fine issued against my barn. A formal written acknowledgement that the original violation notice had been built entirely on inaccurate survey data, and a resolution regarding the clubhouse encroachment, to be negotiated separately, though Denise made it clear, without raising her voice even slightly, that my family had no interest in demolishing a building homeowners depended on, provided a fair and legally binding resolution could be reached quickly. It was, I realized watching Patricia's face in that moment, the most reasonable possible outcome I could have offered her, and somehow it still looked like the worst thing she'd heard all year. The board voted that same night, 5-1, Patricia casting the lone dissenting vote, to formally dismiss every fine against my property and issue a written acknowledgement of the survey error, with a separate committee immediately formed to negotiate the clubhouse encroachment resolution. I walked out of that clubhouse with Denise beside me, both surveys tucked back into their folder, 60 years of my family's fines erased in a single vote, and a question I hadn't expected to still be turning over in my mind. Because as satisfying as that meeting had been, I understood, standing in the parking lot under a sky just beginning to clear after weeks of overcast weather, that we hadn't actually resolved anything yet. We'd simply proven what was true. What happened to Patricia Vance, and what happened to that clubhouse sitting partially on my family's land, was still an open question neither of us could answer that night. I had no idea, walking to my truck with Elaine's report still fresh in my mind, that the committee formed to negotiate that resolution was about to uncover something about Patricia's board tenure that would make the boundary dispute itself feel like the smallest part of this entire story. The negotiation committee Walter chaired spent the following month working through the mechanics of the clubhouse encroachment, and it was during that process that something else surfaced, almost by accident. Buried inside records nobody had thought to examine closely until Elaine's report forced everyone to start looking. Walter, methodical in a way I hadn't expected from someone who'd stayed mostly quiet during that first meeting, requested the original construction phase permitting records as part of the committee's review, simply trying to understand how a survey error that significant had gone unnoticed for 2 years. What he found instead was a change order filed 18 months earlier, authorizing an expansion of the clubhouse's east wing, the exact section sitting on my family's land, approved through an accelerated permitting process that bypassed the community's standard architectural review entirely. The signature authorizing that accelerated approval belonged to Patricia Vance. Denise and I hadn't asked for that document. Walter had simply stumbled onto it while trying to be thorough, and once he found it, he did what I was starting to understand was simply his nature, and brought it straight to the full board rather than letting it sit quietly the way so much of this dispute had sat quietly for years before I ever received that first violation notice. The accelerated approval, it turned out, hadn't been standard practice. Every other significant construction change in Millbrook Farms Estate's history had gone through a full board vote and a mandatory comment period for affected homeowners. This one hadn't, and the reason, once Walter dug further, connected back to something almost absurdly simple. The clubhouse expansion had been completed just 3 weeks before a community-wide vote determining whether the HOA would renew its management contract with the development company that had built Millbrook Farms Estates in the first place, a contract that, as it turned out, included a personal consulting arrangement naming Patricia Vance individually, worth several $1,000s annually, for what the paperwork vaguely described as community liaison services. In plain terms, Patricia had quietly fast-tracked an expansion benefiting the very same development company paying her a personal consulting fee, using an approval process that skipped the scrutiny that expansion would have otherwise faced. All while that expansion happened to be built, unknowingly at the time, on land that didn't legally belong to the HOA at all. I don't know that Patricia ever intended for any of this to surface. I genuinely believe even now that she likely had no idea the original survey was wrong, and that this specific piece, the consulting arrangement and the accelerated approval, existed as its own separate, quieter kind of overreach that simply happened to intersect with mine at exactly the wrong moment for her. But intersect it did, and once Walter brought that change order in front of the full board, the conversation in that clubhouse shifted from a boundary dispute into something considerably larger. The board called a second emergency meeting 2 weeks later, and this time Patricia's composure didn't survive past the first 10 minutes. Walter laid out the timeline plainly, the same way Denise had laid out the boundary discrepancy weeks earlier. And I watched homeowners who'd spent years defending Patricia's aggressive enforcement style start asking, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, how many other decisions during her 5 years as president had been made this way, without the scrutiny the rest of us had simply assumed was happening on our behalf. Patricia resigned before the board could formally vote on removing her, submitting a short written statement citing personal reasons and thanking the community for the opportunity to serve. Nobody in that room seemed especially moved by it. I remember Curtis leaning over to me as she left the clubhouse for what I understood would be the last time in any official capacity, saying quietly that he'd farmed next to this community for 8 years and never once seen a room go that silent that fast. The formal resolution to the actual encroachment came together over the following 2 months, negotiated primarily between Denise, the HOA's incoming leadership, and the original development company, whose corporate legal team seemed considerably more interested in resolving this quickly and quietly than in fighting a claim backed by 2 independent licensed surveys. The final agreement allowed the clubhouse to remain standing exactly where it was, with the HOA formally purchasing the encroaching 1,800 square feet from my family at fair market value, along with a permanent easement agreement ensuring no future dispute could arise from that same section of boundary again. Every fine ever issued against my barn was formally dismissed and refunded, though I'd never actually paid a single one, having decided early on to let the dispute play out through documentation rather than my own money. I want to be clear that I never wanted to see that clubhouse torn down. It genuinely serves this community well, hosting weddings, holiday gatherings, the kind of shared life that makes 600 homes feel like something more than just 600 separate driveways. What I wanted, and what I ultimately got, was simply an honest accounting of where my family's land actually began and ended, something that should have been settled correctly the first time, decades before Patricia Vance ever set foot in this valley. Walter was elected board president less than 2 months after Patricia's resignation, running against no serious opposition. Under his leadership, Millbrook Farms Estates implemented a policy requiring any accelerated or emergency approval process to be documented in writing, with mandatory disclosure of any board member's financial relationship with a vendor, contractor, or the original development company, retroactively applied to any existing consulting or advisory arrangements still in effect. It was, in essence, exactly the kind of transparency that would have caught this 2 years earlier, finally written into policy the way meaningful change usually seems to arrive in communities like this, not proactively, but as the direct consequence of someone finally being forced to explain a decision they never expected anyone to examine closely. My barn is still standing. It'll likely outlast me the same way it's already outlasted my grandfather and my father, weathered and solid, holding tools and equipment across a 4th generation now that my own son has started learning his way around this land the same way I once did. I added a small stone marker near the boundary line last year, right where Elaine's crew located the original 1958 monument, mostly so nobody, HOA board or otherwise, ever mistakes exactly where this land begins again. I think about Patricia sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of quiet understanding of how these things actually happen. She didn't set out, I believe, to build her clubhouse on someone else's land. She simply moved fast, cut a corner she assumed nobody would ever examine, and trusted a survey she never thought to question, the same way an entire community had trusted her leadership for 5 years without ever thinking to question it either. That's the part of this whole ordeal that stays with me the most. Not the barn, not the fines, not even the moment her composure finally broke in that packed clubhouse. It's the reminder that most abuses of power in places like this don't start as dramatic villainy. They start small, a shortcut here, an unquestioned assumption there, and they only ever surface when someone, somewhere, refuses to simply pay the fine and move on. So here's what I keep coming back to, standing at that boundary marker some mornings before the rest of the farm wakes up. How many communities across this country have their own quiet version of this story, built on assumptions nobody's bothered to verify, resting on land, authority, or trust that's never actually been checked. And how many of them are simply waiting for the right barn, the right family, and the right 60-year-old deed to finally ask the question out loud?